Hi. I think I just heard gunshots outside.
Okay. How many shots did you hear?
4.
You heard 4?
I think so, yeah.
The woman choked up and told a 911 operator at 5 a.m. The sound tore through the night of the peaceful town of Chapel Hill, where the sound of cars rolling by is rarer than the sound of a phone ringing in the middle of the night. In a place known as one of the safest college communities in America, few people think they will have to live in fear. But that morning, an invisible unease seemed to creep through every street, every house, every dormitory. Eve Carson, 22 years old, a senior at the University of North Carolina, is someone the whole school knows by name. Not because she is a beauty queen or a social media phenomenon, because she embodied everything that was good about being a young person: smart, sincere, a good leader, and always caring. A student body president and a recipient of prestigious scholarships, Eve had volunteered in Ecuador, Egypt, Cuba, and taught free lessons to indigenous children. On March 5, 2008, Chapel Hill was immersed in a mild early spring breeze. The trees were starting to change leaves, but no one knew that. Behind the peaceful scene, something was about to happen. Something the entire state of North Carolina would never forget. On the night of March 5, 2008, the small house where Eve Carson and her friends rented a room gradually became quiet. As the clock struck 1:30 a.m., her housemates left one by one for a party in the dormitory a few blocks away. Eve declined the invitation, gently shaking her head with a familiar smile and saying that she had an important biology exam later in the week. When the door closed, only the tapping of Eve's keyboard and the soft music from her headphones could be heard in the quiet night. But there was something else present outside. A strange car parked not far from the house. Inside were 2 young men from Durham, a neighboring city. They had no specific plan other than finding someone to get money from. According to later testimony, the car moved quietly around the residential area. As they passed the lighted windows of 519 Friendly Lane, they saw a figure studying in the light. Feeling that this was a safe target, the 2 turned around, stopped, and decided to attack. They broke in through the back door, which was usually unlocked because the area was peaceful. Eve was awakened and faced with 2 guns. She did not scream, did not resist, just silently obeyed. They forced her to take her wallet, bank cards, and phone, and drove them in her own car, starting a journey that lasted more than an hour. At about 3:40 a.m., a camera at an ATM 8 miles away captured the Toyota hybrid stopping. One of the 2 men, later identified as Lawrence Levet, got out of the driver's seat, inserted his card into the machine, and withdrew money from Eve's account. The other man sat in the back seat, his face covered, seemingly restraining the victim. After taking $700, the maximum allowed for the day, they continued to circle the city, trying to find another ATM, but to no avail. Throughout the entire process, Eve never pleaded or made a scene. She remained strangely calm, as if negotiating with fate. There were no direct witnesses to the kidnapping, nor were there any reported screams around the time. Chapel Hill was quiet, and Eve, being her usual self, seemed to have tried to keep quiet to avoid escalating the danger. But unfortunately, the gunmen did not leave her alone. At around 5 a.m., as the night began to fade, they drove to a deserted road near a small forest. There, Eve was pulled out of the car. She offered to pray with them. And then, the shots rang out. On a remote street called Hillcrest Circle, while most of the residents were still asleep, an elderly woman woke up to a strange sound coming through her bedroom window. At first, she thought it was fireworks, but then a scream that sent shivers down her spine, shook her. With trembling hands, she dialed 911, her voice cracking as she said, "I heard shots," and someone screaming. Something serious is going on out there. The operator tried to stay calm, quickly locating and dispatching a patrol unit to the scene. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 police cars appeared. Headlights swept across the foggy street. In the dim light of the streetlights, a motionless figure appeared, lying on her side on the grass. A female officer got out and approached, her flashlight beam illuminating the victim. It was a young woman, blonde, with a slender figure. The wounds were obvious, the unmistakable evidence of a violent attack. No identification, no purse, no phone. Her clothes were neat, no signs of physical abuse. What shook the officers was that her eyes were still open, as if she had not yet realized what had happened. There were few clues at the scene. There were no shell casings, no witnesses, and the surroundings were completely quiet. The police cordoned off the area with yellow tape, trying to preserve every detail they could. The traces on the ground, wheel tracks, faint footprints, and a trail of blood were the only things they had at the time. She was sent to the medical examiner without her identity being determined. But at about the same time, a missing person report came in from a group of students who lived less than 2 miles away. They were worried about Eve Carson, her roommate who had not returned from a night of studying. The description matched the girl who had just been found. An investigator brought a photo from UNC's school records to the medical examiner's office. When the image appeared, a medical staff member was silent for a few seconds before nodding. It was her. Eve Carson, a star student, student body president, was the victim. The news spread quickly throughout the university community. An eerie silence fell over the campus. Where Eve had once smiled at people in the hallways, tears now filled her eyes. No one could believe that something so terrible could have happened to her. Returning to the scene that same morning, in the pale early spring sunlight, forensic technicians carefully traced every detail. The lawn where Eve was found was still damp with dew. The blood had formed a clear trail, extending from the victim's torso to the roadway, as if she had been pushed out of the car and then collapsed in despair. There were no personal belongings around the body, phone, wallet, keys, all gone. But what caught the investigators' attention most was how clean the scene was. Not a single shell casing, no sign of a struggle, as if all traces had been swept from that space, except for a faint tire mark on the ground in the distance. The autopsy determined that the victim had died from multiple gunshot wounds. 2 had penetrated the head, 3 others had penetrated the chest and arm. She died almost instantly, less than a minute after the first shot. Remarkably, at least 2 types of bullets were used, suggesting there was more than one shooter. The autopsy confirmed there were no signs of sexual assault, and there were almost no scratches on her body, as if she had not resisted or had no chance to. The bullet wounds were the only message the killer left behind: cold, cruel, and purposeful. When the victim was identified as Eve Carson, Chapel Hill police knew they were dealing with more than just a murder. They were dealing with a shock that would shock the entire state. A college student, a prominent member of the community, murdered near her home. It was no longer a simple crime, but a challenge to the entire civil defense system. The investigation was immediately raised to the highest priority. Joint teams with the FBI and the Organized Crime Division were formed within 24 hours of the case being confirmed. The first clue came from nothing. There were no witnesses. There were no security cameras near the area where Eve was killed. But there was still a chance. The victim's car, a silver Toyota hybrid, had disappeared from the scene and from her home. 3 days later, a resident in a neighboring town reported an unfamiliar car parked in front of her house for 2 days. When the police went to investigate, they confirmed that it was Eve's car. Importantly, there were traces left inside the car. The door handles, the steering wheel, the gear shift, all were sealed and sent to the lab for testing. At the same time, The bank's credit card investigation department reported several strange transactions on Eve's card just hours after she was taken. A $700 cash withdrawal made in 2 transactions at an ATM across town. That matched the daily withdrawal limit. When the police checked the ATM's camera, they saw something that made everyone speechless. A strange man sitting in Eve's car was making a withdrawal with her card. The face was unclear, but behind the driver's seat, there was another figure. They weren't sure it was Eve, but the image left a lump in the chest of everyone who saw it. From there, the investigation branched into 2 directions: following the car and analyzing biological traces, and following the ATM card, checking the cameras at each location where the transaction was recorded. Police determined that after the first transaction, Eve's card had been used at 3 other ATMs, most of which had no working cameras. Only one ATM at the convenience store that was still active recorded a new image, this time of a different person. After the evening news aired the frame, a call came straight into the police department. "I know him. That's Dario Atwater." Dario, 21, had a lengthy criminal record for weapons possession, assault, and theft, but had been released early for good behavior. Further investigation revealed that Dario had been texting and calling another teenager, Lawrence Levette, 17, who also had a criminal record. Lawrence's mugshot was compared to the first ATM camera footage, which was the man in Eve's car. An arrest warrant was issued. On March 12th, Dario was arrested at his home. He did not resist arrest, but he maintained a cold demeanor. Despite the explicit video, Dario insisted that he had only borrowed the card from an acquaintance who knew nothing about the murder. Lawrence was different. When police arrived at his home, he locked the door and refused to cooperate. The situation became so tense that the SWAT team was called in. After nearly 2 hours of negotiations, he finally came out. There was no weapon on him, but in the bedroom, the police found a small caliber gun, the same type of bullet that had hit Eve. The interrogation began. Lawrence denied all charges, saying he did not know Eve, did not drive her car, had nothing to do with the card. But when he was shown the clip at the ATM, his expression changed slightly. His eyes lost their initial calmness. Meanwhile, Dario began to waver when he heard that Lawrence had been arrested. After 3 days in custody, he agreed to confess on the condition that he would not be sentenced to death, and that confession froze the atmosphere in the investigation room. Dario recounted that it was Lawrence who invited them to go make some quick money. They brought 2 guns with no specific target. When they saw Eve sitting alone in the house, they thought she was an easy target. They both entered the house through the back door, restrained the victim, and forced her into the car. Dario said Eve did not panic. She convinced them to take all the money, even promising not to call the police, as long as she was released safely. But when the daily withdrawal limit was reached, things began to fall apart. Lawrence, Dario said, "She knows too much." And then, on a deserted stretch of road near the edge of the woods, Eve was forced out of the car. She asked for prayers. In that moment, Dario said, the little girl stood still, her eyes unwavering. Then a gunshot, 4 more. With testimony, DNA evidence from the steering wheel, video footage from Lawrence's home, and a gun that matched the bullet used in the crime, the case file was complete. 2 suspects, 1 adult, 1 juvenile, were formally charged with first-degree murder, armed kidnapping, and organized robbery. Dario Atwater's trial began in April 2010. He entered the courtroom without handcuffs or bowing his head, but with a glazed look in his eyes, as if he knew what was going to happen. In court, Dario pleaded guilty in a deal with prosecutors to avoid the death penalty. His testimony left the courtroom frozen. From breaking into Eve's home, forcing her into a car, to her final hours being forced to move through ATMs, and finally praying at gunpoint, every detail was heartbreaking. When he was allowed to speak, Dario looked at the victim's parents. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want to say I did the indefensible." He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 30 years. In late 2011, Lawrence Lovett, who was 17 at the time of the crime, entered the courtroom as the defendant. He pleaded not guilty. His defense attorneys argued that Lawrence was merely manipulated and did not intend to kill. But the surveillance video, DNA evidence, the weapon found in the room, and testimony from Dario undermined any defense. Lawrence was sentenced to life in prison, but 2 years later, a ruling from the North Carolina Supreme Court allowed juvenile defendants to have their life sentences reconsidered. A new trial began in 2013. Lawrence said, "I was just a teenager who went astray. I am not who people think I am." The judge rejected the defense. "There is no remorse in your word," he declared before upholding the original sentence. Justice had been served, but for the Chapel Hill community and Eve's family, no sentence could fill the void Eve left. Eve Carson was more than a victim. She was a symbol of what a young person can be: a blossoming mind, a heart for community, a leader born to make change. But that light was extinguished not by fate, but by two people who chose the dark side. Her death not only devastated her family and friends, but also caused the entire United States to look back at the gaps in our legal system and community. From that event, a new law was enacted in North Carolina, strengthening penalties for organized crime, especially those involving juvenile gangs. UNC built a memorial garden right in the center of campus, where students can sit quietly, read a quote from Eve, and ask themselves what they are living for. The scholarship fund in her name continues to nurture unfinished dreams. The case is closed, but the echoes are not. It reminds us that safety can never be taken for granted. It reminds us that kindness, no matter how bright, can be vulnerable if left unprotected. And it raises a difficult question. In a changing world, how can we keep the light from being extinguished too soon?